My parents favored my twin sister so much that they spent our wedding fund on her. I cut them off after rejecting my mom's selfish demand that I have a twin sister. I'm not on good terms with my twin sister Allison. I'm not even on speaking terms with my parents. We used to be on speaking terms, but for the last 2 years I've kept my distance. They hadn't reached out to me either until recently. Allison is 12 minutes older than me and by default the golden child because she's older. My parents only wanted one kid because that's what they had planned for, and they didn't have the means to raise two. By the time they found out it was too late, and my mom didn't want to risk anything. I found out about this around the time I was in high school from my drunk uncle. I met my uncle at a Thanksgiving party, and that was basically the day I stopped trying to win my parents over. They'd done the most natural thing somebody in those circumstances could do. They had 2 kids and decided that only one of them would be loved. That was Allison, not me. From when we were kids, there was a lot of sibling rivalry between me and Allison. I tried to do everything she did just to impress our parents, but they just seemed to hate me more for outdoing their golden child. I think it's fair to say that my parents resented me for outdoing their golden child. I'll be honest, Allison wasn't interested in being better than me. She just wanted people to validate her, so she'd pretend she cared about the competition we had going on. I'll admit that she was good at manipulation and making people believe that she actually felt hurt when I did things better. This led to a lot of people validating her feelings and putting me down to make her feel better. These people included my parents and a couple of our relatives. And even some people from high school. So, what I got out of the competition was good grades and lots of extracurriculars so I could be better than my sister. What she got out of this was my parents and other people's attention, validation, and sympathy because I was clearly the bad guy for making her feel less. Looking back, I don't think I would trade that, but I sure would like to rub it in her face more than I did at the time. 2 years ago, we celebrated our 21st birthdays. By then we'd both graduated. She graduated from a regular college, but I'd graduated from one of the top business schools in the state. Not only that, I'd also been the valedictorian and had been on a scholarship. This meant that my parents had saved quite a lot on my education. They were a little surprised, but I expected them to be happy about it. Allison and her future were the only things on my parents' minds. She'd barely scraped by, and we'd moved back home. While I was already working from home at a firm as an intern, Allison was still looking for jobs and getting rejected left and right. My parents cared more about that and hadn't even bothered to congratulate me. I wasn't surprised, but I was disappointed. I tried to hide it because I was still living with my parents. I hadn't saved up enough to move out yet, so I decided I'd just keep my mouth shut about my feelings. After our 21st birthday, though, I just couldn't anymore. I expected them to do something big for us, but the day before our birthday, I discovered that everyone had left me home alone. All they'd left for me was a note saying they were heading to the beach with Allison and her friends and would be back after a couple of days. I remember being really disappointed when I read that note. They'd gone to the beach with Allison and her friends while I just got a happy birthday note and a $50 gift card. There were a lot of unfair things about my childhood, but that was the last straw. It was so disappointing and heartless that I decided to move out that day and never look back. I had a couple of friends who were willing to let me stay with them. I found a place of my own pretty quickly. It wouldn't take long because the firm I was entering was probably going to hire me after the internship was over, so I just needed a place to live for 2 months at most. I packed my stuff and moved in with a friend of mine without telling my parents or sister. And I haven't looked back even once. They did call me on my birthday the day after I moved out, but they didn't miss me enough to ask me to come back. After I moved out, they called to say they'd be back soon and that I should probably get a plumber to fix the tap. I told them I wasn't living at home and that I'd moved out, hoping they'd react. But they seemed fine with it and Allison didn't care, so that was it. That was the last time I spoke to them. I haven't had a proper conversation with my family since then. I haven't gone back to see them and I haven't heard from them either. I did hear about Allison sometimes from my friends though. That's how I stayed updated on her life. They didn't know anything about my parents, and my parents didn't know anything about me. I've worked hard over the past 2 years, and now I have a place of my own. It's not a mansion, but it's a nice apartment in a good neighborhood. The rent is affordable with my income, which is great because most people my age haven't been able to get here so quickly. I'm happy with how my life has turned out, and I've tried to keep my family out of my head. I know that Allison got married a couple of months ago to a businessman almost 10 years older than her, and is now living it up in. I thought everything was okay with my family. 2 days ago, though, I got a call from my uncle. He told me I had to come to visit my parents quickly because they'd been in a bad car crash and wanted to see me. I rushed to the hospital as soon as I could. When I got there, I found out that they'd already been in the hospital for a couple of days and were healing from their injuries. A truck had the car they were in was hit, and they survived, but they had serious injuries. They didn't have health insurance because my dad believed that if we just took care of ourselves, we wouldn't need the hospital at all. That's one of the most idiotic takes I've ever heard. They'd first contacted my sister, but she told them that she wasn't going to come back, and that she wasn't going to help them. Apparently, it was tacky of our parents to ask. She didn't want to seem like she was a gold digger to her husband, so she didn't want to fly back either. After all, she couldn't just abandon her home and her 2 kids, who weren't even her own. They were her husband's kids from a previous marriage. She was too busy playing happy family with her husband's family to come see her own parents in the hospital after a terrible car accident. She was in the hospital after a terrible car accident, but she couldn't help her parents with the bills even if she wanted to. Her husband wasn't there for her, so she couldn't afford even the flight tickets back home. She's a stay-at-home mom now to kids who aren't even her own. I couldn't believe that they hadn't realized that she was the golden child. They could have at least called me first. It got even more infuriating when my uncle said that my parents now wanted me to cover their medical expenses. It's obviously a huge amount, and it'll take me a long time to recover from a financial loss like that. I don't want to have to spend so much, especially on people who never cared for me or showed me any love. My entire life they've had other family to take care of them. If I don't pay for them, someone else will. It's just that it'll probably be more humiliating for them to take money from others, and they'll definitely have to return it a lot sooner than they would have had to return the money to me. At least that's what they told me while requesting me to cover the bills. They even promised that I'd have the money back in no time, so I don't know what to do. I'm in a tough spot. I can either refuse to pay my parents' medical bills and look out for myself, or I can pay for them and lose out on my own money. I'm not inclined to pay for them at all. We haven't spoken in the last 2 years, and things have been bad between me and my family for as long as I can remember. As good as strangers to me now, so I don't feel the need to help them out right now. But then that would mean I'm no better than Allison, which would be a bad look. So I decided not to help my parents pay their hospital bills after they were in a really bad car accident. Hey there, I wasn't worried about it. They only asked me because they didn't want to ask their other relatives and were being too egocentric. I haven't told them about it yet, though. How do you even tell your family that you're not going to be helping your parents cover their medical expenses after they've been in such a terrible accident? It's been almost 5 days since I met them. After reading the comments, I realized that I was still subconsciously competing. With Allison, she didn't help our parents, so I felt the need to step up and prove that I was the better daughter or whatever. I guess I'll never be able to get rid of that competitive streak, no matter how hard I try. It's just who I am now. Most of the comments said that it was stupid of my parents to not have health insurance, and I agree. It was really stupid of my father to discourage that. If I had been part of their lives, I would have made sure that he got insurance. He didn't have insurance either. He didn't even have his car insured because he thought he was a great driver. They're lucky the accident was the truck driver's fault, because otherwise the cost of the car repairs would also be coming from their own pockets. I'll tell you about my parents' financial situation, which a lot of you have asked about. My parents are okay. They're not rich, they're not poor. My dad is the sales head of the company he works in. My parents work in different companies. My dad is the sales head of the company he works in, and my mom works in HR at a smaller firm. Their combined income is enough for them, and since they no longer have to support me or Allison, I'd say they have sufficient income. Allison and I didn't have to worry about money, but of course we couldn't live extravagantly. We were in the middle, and we still are, but I can't figure out why my parents won't be able to pay for their bills themselves if they can borrow money. Then they promised to return the money eventually. Surely they can just pay the bills themselves. They haven't told me the reason why, and I don't think I'll be able to find out after this. I told my parents that I won't be covering their expenses. They'd been calling me for the past week. Yesterday I finally realized that I couldn't ignore them and let this go on until they were out of the hospital. So I answered their calls and told them, I told them I'd thought about it and that I didn't think I felt the need to help them. As you might imagine, they didn't take it very well and were very angry about it. My mom totally tore into me and yelled at me as loudly as she could, given her broken ribs. She called me ungrateful and other names. My dad just told me that I was no longer their daughter, and disconnected the call after my mom was done yelling at me. I thought it would because I hadn't been their daughter for a really long time. I mean, I can't even remember the last time I felt loved by my parents. They hadn't spoken to me on purpose or checked up on me for 2 years just because I'd moved out after they'd ignored me on an important birthday. I'd never had parents anyway, so I'm just going to lead my life the way I did for the last 2 years, and probably even before that, it didn't make much of a difference to me as my parents had thought it would. Unfortunately, my uncle did call me after the phone call with my parents to give me another piece of his mind, but I hung up after the first couple of seconds because I didn't need this from others. They could think whatever they wanted about me. It just didn't matter to me at this point. My uncle then texted me to inform me that they still had another family to arrange the money from. My parents had decided to use the money from the fund they'd set aside for our wedding. They'd already spent more than half of the wedding fund on Allison's wedding, and whatever little money they had left after that, they'd spent on a Europe trip. That's why they barely had any savings left and couldn't pay for themselves. My uncle had told me everything. It made me feel bad, but all it made me feel was relief that I hadn't spent my hard-earned money on my parents' bills. They'd spent their own savings irresponsibly, and that wasn't my fault. They're not having insurance because of their own delusional beliefs, and that wasn't my fault. Now they could borrow money from their relatives or go to hell, but I wasn't giving them anything. They weren't entitled to anything that was mine anymore, not my time and definitely not. My money update number 3. Something strange happened today, and I need to get this off my chest. I haven't been able to tell my friends about what's going on with me because most of them don't know me well yet. I'm not ready to share anything about my family history with them. Reddit is my only option. It's been almost 2 weeks since I last spoke to my parents. A few hours ago, Allison showed up at my place. I was surprised because I didn't think she'd know where I was living. One of our old friends from high school told her the neighborhood I lived in. She did some asking around to find out where I was, which was a lot of effort for her to undertake to meet me. She also looks and acts very differently from what I remembered. She's become more refined and sophisticated. It's been a big change. She used to talk like she was still in high school, but now she sounds more mature. She even dresses better and wears different jewelry and makeup. It felt like I wasn't even talking to Allison. She's changed a lot, but one thing hasn't. She's still the same person. You can't put makeup on your heart and tell people to, I guess you could call her Mrs. Davis, just like she did with herself. Her personality and beliefs haven't changed much, if at all. I let her in after she knocked on my door, and I was really surprised to see her. I was also curious to know why she'd come by, so I decided to talk to her after some small talk about her life. She told me everything that she'd been up to unprompted and bragged about how great her life was as a stay-at-home mom of 2. She was married to a wealthy guy and didn't have to worry about anything except her cuticles. I waited for her to get to the point while politely nodding at her speech about how great being a traditional housewife was. She even advised me to do the same, so I really couldn't wait for her to finish talking about irrelevant things and get to the point, which she did after about 15 minutes of talking about her life. She told me that she'd come back. She came to visit us after the accident, despite her parents asking her to. They didn't want money, just her company. After 2 weeks, she came back and said she wanted to meet my family. So far so good. But then she started complaining about her parents being needy and disrespectful. She went on and on about it. She said she had to leave her kids with their nanny just to visit us, and that she hated us for making her choose between us and her kids. I don't understand why she keeps calling them her kids when they're not. She told me a lot about her marriage and her husband, even though I hadn't asked. From what I've heard, he probably only married her to increase his chances. She thought he loved her, but he was really just trying to get at least partial custody of his kids, which he did. He'd been in the custody battle for quite some time, and since he was a full-time businessman, he didn't have enough time to spare for his kids. His ex-wife was using that against him, but then he announced that he was engaged and was getting married as soon as the divorce came through, which tilted the scales for him. Allison told me all of this while she was bragging about how she'd saved those kids, but it just sounded like her husband had used her. They hadn't even known each other for more than a year when he asked her to marry him, so it was clear that he wasn't in love with her. Nobody falls in love that quickly, especially after a divorce. She seemed blissfully unaware of it, or maybe she knew that he didn't love her but was willing to look past that because of the huge bank balance. On top of that, she was mad at her own parents for wanting her to be by their side after they'd been in a really bad accident. She felt that her time with her new family, a husband who probably didn't even love her much and 2 kids who were not related to her at all, was being taken away from her. Have you ever had a face like Allison's? I'm not a fan of my parents myself, but honestly, when she was talking to me about how they were being too needy, I couldn't believe that this was the girl they'd rejected me over and over again for. She got to the point of her visit and told me that she'd be leaving in 2 days. She'd promised Mom and Dad that she'd stay for at least a month, but she said that she was already tired of listening to them talk about the accident and how they'd had the worst experience of their lives for the 10th time. They needed to get back home soon, so now she wanted me to reconcile with them and take her place. She didn't want to feel guilty about abandoning her parents when they needed her. She didn't know that they'd cut me off because I refused to help them with the bills, probably because they don't talk about me or even think of me, so they didn't bring that up with Allison. She was here because she wanted sympathy for me because she'd had to deal with our parents and had to abandon her family. Now she wanted to use that sympathy for her own gain and make me step into her shoes and become our parents' emotional support because she didn't feel up to the task. It was just classic Allison manipulation, but I knew it all too well and didn't fall for it. I also had no intention of telling her that while she was at my house, which would inevitably lead to a fight. So I told her that I'd try, but I know I won't. She left after telling me to keep in touch, but we both know she doesn't mean that. I was actually glad to see the back of her because not only was she a terrible narcissistic person, and she's also really boring to talk to. I could barely get a word in while she droned on about her uninteresting life in California. It basically revolves around parties, her stepchildren, and her husband. She thinks she's living the life, but I thought it was sad since her husband doesn't love her, and her kids spend half their time with their mom anyway. Naturally, they'll gravitate towards their biological family over Allison. In fact, I've heard they already do. It's understandable, given the circumstances. But that's their choice. I've chosen a different path. I'm moving away from my family because I don't want to be tied down to them. I've realized today that I've been right to distance myself from my parents and my sister. I don't want to be part of their lives. They're selfish and cruel. I doubt they're capable of thinking of anyone but themselves, especially Allison. I'm ashamed to be related to such people. At least now I've been able to cut ties with them for good. It isn't likely they'll be able to get in touch with me anytime soon. I don't think they'll be able to get in touch with me anytime soon. I blocked Allison as soon as she left, and I've already had my parents and other relatives blocked for a couple of days, so I think I'm safe from being troubled by my family for at least the near future. I hope they don't get back in touch with me after this because I'm better off without them.